So this is my Kyosho Triumph. I made a video about this a couple of years ago, and I think at the time I had a long-term plan of making it a runner. I don't quite remember, but I do have this general rule of two, where if I'm going to have a runner, then I need to have another one that's in good condition for a shelf. So I do have two, which is good. This one, I did buy a third one that I was going to completely restore, but it was so beat up, I figured I would just take this one and turn it into a runner. So anyway, what is special about this particular Triumph that I used, that I built out, that you might want to consider if you have a Kyosho Triumph that you want to make into a runner? Well, there's a few things. As you can see here, I have big bore shocks. So the original Triumph came with those old style, Kyosho gold shocks, which are very nice and they're very smooth. But I prefer to try to use Kyosho big bores on all of my vintage Kyosho stuff because parts are readily available: shock shafts, seals, pistons. I have a better idea of how to tune these big bore shocks than all the older standard bore shocks, because they all tend to have different piston designs, and it's just kind of a pain to sort of relearn for each shock type what are all the piston types, because they're all a little different in their design, and how to tune them for shock oil. So anyway, the way these are set up is the actual shock bodies themselves are truck bodies. So this is the rear truck body, and this is the front truck body for the shock body. And the shock shafts are buggy shafts. So this would be the rear buggy shaft and the front buggy shaft. And all I really mean by that is the shock shafts come in, I believe, 3 lengths, like a short, a medium, and a long. So we'd use the medium for the rear shock shaft and the short for the front shock shaft. And this gives you a total shock length that's about the right length to give you the correct amount of droop on the arms and not have it be, way too droopy or not droopy enough. I don't have any down travel limiters inside the shock body, but on the rear shocks I have a little bit of an up travel limiter here, so that way when the suspension bottoms out, the rear plate here doesn't slam into the ground. On the front there are no limiters at all, and that's it for the shocks. Lunsford turnbuckles, nothing really special there. I do like to use RPM ball cups because they tend to be stronger than most other ball cups. Like the Kyosho modern ball cups are pretty good too. So then it's just a question of whether it's easier to use 4.3 millimeter ball studs, which would be the old Associated style, or the 4.8 millimeter ball studs, which are the modern Kyosho style. So I have a bunch of 4.3 millimeter ball studs, and you can get more of them from, I believe, 3 Racing. They make aluminum ball studs of a 4.3 millimeter diameter. You can also get 4.8s from them, which is great. So these are all 4.3s. The front here, to the trained eye, this caster block and steering knuckle is actually not from the Kyosho Triumph. This is from the Kyosho RB5, and it's actually a perfect fit, which was kind of surprising. I was trying to figure out a way to run hex front wheels on this car, and the one approach is to use the original wheel axle with like a GPM like hex mount, if you will. It has like little bearings on the inside. I talked about that in another video. I think on one of the Traxxas is on my Rad 2. If you look at my Traxxas Rad 2 video, I talk about that. Now the thing is, the stock wheel axle for the front of the Kyosho Triumph does not have a 5 millimeter diameter. It's a 4 millimeter diameter. So even those little wheel hex adapters don't work. You would need to get a different bearing to fit on the inside. So then I had to think about, okay, well, what about the Traxxas TRX3 setup, which has a 30-degree caster block with 2 mounting holes for the camber link instead of in and out. Here it's up and down. and the steering knuckle with the caster block is just the right amount of offset so that everything should fit, either with that hex adapter, or if I just take a bearing front wheel and put the right size bearings in there and mount it. But I ran into some issues, excuse me, some issues with that, which I won't really get into. But the short story is, if you can find Kyosho RB5 parts, and they're still kind of available on eBay, build out the caster block and the hex wheel axle and the steering knuckle and everything, and it's a perfect fit, or a near perfect fit, especially considering the way that the steering block is shaped. So it's vertically asymmetric, maybe a little hard to see here, but this arm that comes out from here doesn't come out from the exact center of the steering block. It's actually offset upwards. And the original Triumph steering knuckles also did that a little bit. It had like an upward offset to this arm that comes out of the steering block. So if you use any other type of setup here with a different type of steering block that's more symmetric, you'd have to put spacers on the underside of the steering block as it mounts into the caster block to push everything up so that you have the correct bump steer setting here. There's still a little bit of bump steer, but it's decent. The problem is, some other caster blocks don't have any room to adjust the height of the steering knuckle. So having this setup is actually very convenient. It's basically a perfect fit. And the RB5 does have some tunability here for the steering block height. You can see, I think that's a 2mm spacer right there. So I can either do 1 and 1, 2 on the bottom, or 2 on top. Right now it's 2 on the bottom. And yeah, it's a perfect fit. Now in terms of the offset and what it does to the front width as it compares to the rear width, in order to make the widths match front and rear with modern front rims and modern rear hex rims, these are both Kyosho style rims. On the rear, what I do is, with the Triumph, you have an adjustable rear arm. So there's 2 holes here and 2 holes here, and it was originally meant to allow you to adjust rear toe-in. So I could basically mount this little shaft goes in here, and you have a grub screw that locks through the shaft, and depending on which holes you use, you can make the rear wider or narrower, or have more toe, or have neutral toe. So I set it up so that this is all the way out. So I use the outside 2 holes to make the car wide. And then here I happen to have MIP CVDs that were originally meant for the Pro X and the Rampage Pro. They do fit on this chassis if you use the long option for the arms. And then on the outside here, I have an 8mm wide wheel hex. So with that 8mm wide wheel hex and modern rear rims, that gives you the same width as the front of the chassis with this RB5 setup and modern hex front rims. Okay, so that actually seems to work fine. Now, other things that I didn't do anything special to the gearbox at all. I actually didn't even take the gearbox apart. It was assembled very nicely on this car when I got it. So I just, changed the diff tightness a little bit and just installed the motor, set up the slipper, and you're ready to go. So thankfully I didn't have to tear that apart. What did I do for the electronics mounting on the inside? So this is where it gets a little tricky, because like a lot of these older chassis, there's no LiPo battery tray. And so in my case, I improvised a little bit. So what I did here is I do use a shorty pack, just a conventional 4.2 amp hour shorty. Do I have one lying around here? No, I must put it away. So that fits here between the front of the speed control and the back of the steering servo. Now that shorty mounted in this way will only work if I use a low profile servo up here. So I have this Trackstar, I think TS D99X servo. It's a pretty good servo. I've used it in other models as well. So I'm using that here. And in order to, so the back of the servo kind of acts as like the front brace for the lipo. And then going to the back here, maybe it's a little hard to see with the lighting, there is this piece here. Okay, so on the Triumph, you had basically two of these. One would go to the back, one would go to the front, and that would kind of hold your NiCad cells in place that you would then strap down from the top. So you just take one of those, you don't have to cut it, you don't have to do anything special. You just mount it toward the front holes on the chassis. So for the battery mounting, you had, two sets of holes, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I use these two front holes here to mount this tray, because it screws in through these two holes. And from that tray to the back of the low profile servo, that's just enough room to mount a shorty lipo. So then it comes down to how do you actually brace it. So I use just some standoff posts here with little thumb screws. I just got these thumb screws from eBay. And then for the actual battery strap, this is a part that I actually had to cut and modify, which is a little terrifying because it's an original part. But nonetheless, you know, you can do this with a carbon fiber plate or whatever. So I just make a little T-strap here. So that way with the thumb screws in and these little foam spacers in here, it holds the lipo down. And then on the back I have speed control. I actually cut out a Kydex plate to mount the speed control and the switch to, because I didn't want to tape that to this chassis. This is like a newer chassis with very low wear, so I want to try to preserve that. So I just took the Kydex plate, cut it out to fit the speedo, and then I have, I think, 2 screws here that go through, and it's kind of hard to see, but I have lock nuts on either side to just hold that plate down to the chassis, and then I just mount the speed control on that. And then for the receiver, it's mounted up here with a little bit of Velcro. And then that's it. I've actually done some indoor testing with this on my little jump setup there. And it works okay. You know, I might need a little bit of tuning. But as far as shock setup goes on these big bore shocks, what do I have? I have 5 by 1.2 pistons front and rear. I have Losi red shocks up front and Kyosho Truck red springs on the back. In terms of oil, I have 40 weight Losi 40 weight oil up front and 35 weight oil in the rear. And this is pretty good. It gives it a decent amount of pack. The car doesn't, you know, slap the ground too much. I haven't checked the ride height. I think it's in the low 20s somewhere. But it's a pretty good car. It's actually very smooth. It, you know, handles pretty nice. You have to tap the brakes to get the car to rotate. The sort of like handling not on power or not on the brakes when it's just kind of coasting around the turn, that's where it pushes a little bit. But that's probably just natural to this type of car. But otherwise, it's a pretty decent car, actually. I was surprised. So, you know, another potential Vonats runner. I don't know if I'll bring it this year. I have a list of two-wheel drive buggies I'm still debating on what I'm going to bring. But at some point I would like to run this. This is actually pretty neat. So anyway, I figured I'd show you guys what I did. There's a few little things here and there that, you know, you can tweak to make it more modern, to run modern rims and things as I described. And yeah, that's basically it. So thanks for watching.